Hello there, my name is Chelsea Seaburn. Welcome to the Smart Student channel, where today I want to talk about how to reference and cite various social media accounts such as YouTube, podcast, blog, Facebook, Instagram, you name it. The first thing I want to let you know though is that this video is time-stamped because I know that most likely you're looking how to cite one of those social media accounts, not all of these. So if that's the case, be sure to use those timestamps to navigate to that portion of the video. But with no further ado, let's get started. So the first thing I want to do is quickly cover the 4 elements that make up every single reference list entry and the 2 formatting principles that those reference list entries fall under. It's important that you understand this information first, otherwise you're going to be lost and wondering why I'm putting what where I do later in the examples. So let's talk about those 4 elements. No matter what you're trying to reference, that reference list entry will always be made up of an author, a date, a title, and a source. Now, with social media, you might be wondering, are they all authors? They're a little different, but basically you want to think about the person that created it. So if it's a podcast, who is the narrator? If it's a blog post, who is the author that wrote it? If it's a YouTube channel, who was the presenter? Other than that, everything stays the same. Now, I know you're probably wondering also, well, sometimes the title's italicized, sometimes the source is italicized. How do I know how to format which one? And so that's actually exactly what you need to remember, is that all references will be formatted either by an italic source or an italic title. If it's an italic title, it simply means that the work stands alone. And on the other hand, if it's an italic source, it simply means that the work is a part of a greater whole. This is important to understand because, for example, a podcast episode is a part of a podcast channel, a podcast itself. Therefore, that podcast episode is a part of a greater whole, and the source would be italicized. Same thing for a blog post. One single blog post belongs to an entire blog, therefore it's a part of a greater whole, and again, the source is what would be italicized. Now, if you have something else like a Facebook post or an Instagram post or even a YouTube video, those are works that stand alone, therefore their title will be italicized. If you're wondering, well, why wouldn't a YouTube video be a part of a greater whole? It's because a YouTube video itself is considered its own entity. Yes, it belongs to a channel, but it is its own piece of content, which is why it falls under a work that stands alone. These formatting principles will make more sense when I get into the examples, which I'm about to do right now. So let me get into my computer and let me walk you through an example of each one of these. And here we are. All right, so the way this is going to be structured is that I've created a template for each example. Note how they're color-coded to reflect the 4 elements of the reference list entries. I then have a real example applying the template using those 4 elements, as well as what the corresponding in-text citation would look like. But let's go ahead and zoom in here on our first example, which is a podcast episode. Starting with the author element, since this is a podcast episode, you're looking for the host information. Now, please note how you also need to include the word host in parentheses. While it may not be apparent why you do this in the template, if you look down here in the example, it's because, well, when you include the host's information, it's going to look like any other author element. And so that's why you want to clarify that this is the host and we're referencing a podcast. Next, the date element contains the traditional information in that it includes the year, month, and day. Then for the source, you want to include the episode title, the number of the episode in parentheses, and a brief description of this work. So down here in the example, the episode title is Amusement Park, the number is 443, and then the description is stating that this is an audio podcast episode. Then for the source information, you have in the name of the podcast, the production company, and the URL. So this is where I want to point out that the source information is what's italicized in the reference list entry. This is because a podcast episode falls under the category of a work that is a part of a greater whole, because one podcast episode belongs to an entire podcast, which is why the source is what's italicized. Lastly, you can see the in-text citation right here, which follows the traditional pattern for in-text citations in that you include the author's last name or the host's last name in this example and the date. Now let's move on to a blog post. So starting with the template, we are looking for the author because an author would write a blog post. You have the date element right here. For the title, you want to include the title of the blog post, and then for the source, you want to include the title of the blog and the URL. Again, note how the title of the blog for the source element is what is italicized because a blog post is a part of a greater whole or a full blog in this example. So looking down here, we have all of the elements filled out nicely. It's kind of hard to see the title of the blog, but it's right there. And then the in-text citation, again, follows the traditional patterns for in-text citations. But now let's move on to some different examples that are going to fall in line with your more, when you think of social media. So we have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. Let's talk about referencing those, starting with Facebook. So here we have the author element. This is going to be the person who wrote the post. You have the year, month, day for the date element. Because Facebook will show you the date down to the day, then I want you to take a look at the title element because we haven't run into this yet. So in the template, it says that you should include the content of the post up to the first 20 words. That's exactly what it sounds like. Why? Well, because there is no title when you post something on social media like Facebook. Instead, you have the description where you type out your content. So you're going to include the first 20 words, then you're going to include a description of what you're trying to cite in those square brackets, the site name and the URL for the source. So looking down here at the example, the author in this case is a group author. So this was found on the National Institute of Mental Health social media or Facebook post in this example. Here's the date, and then we have those first 20 words of the content right here. They're in italicized font because now these posts are considered works that stand alone. Even though they belong to a Facebook page, when you post a social media post, that is its own entity, at least per APA standards. So the description here is that this is an infographic. Then you have Facebook for the site name and the URL right here. Please note that for the in-text citation, we're following the criteria for citing a group author. That simply means that there's no author element or last name included here. You're using the group author, which is the National Institute of Mental Health. Cool. Moving on to the next example. And I'm actually going to group the next two together because their templates are identical. So let's talk about Twitter and Instagram. And when it comes to this template, everything stays the same to the previous one, except that you need to include the username in square brackets after the author element. So when it comes to Twitter, here would be the author of the Twitter account. In other words, who posted this post that you're trying to reference. You then have their username formalized right here in those square brackets. The reason APA wants both is because sometimes your username may be different than your actual name. This is actually pretty common, where your name is something, but you name your social media account something else. This is why APA wants you to decipher between the two. Next, we have the date element. For the title, we have the content of the post up to the first 20 words. This is a great example because this is simply all the content had. There is no 20 words, so it's okay to only include a few if that's all you have. The description here is indicating that this Twitter post has an image attached, and that is what you're referencing. You have the site name of Twitter and the URL. Not too bad. And again, since Instagram's template is identical, I'm not going to go through this one in detail. If anything, I'm just going to point out that again, we have the author of this Instagram account, we have their username, the date, the content of the post up to those first 20 words. We have the description, which for this one, we are referencing a photograph. And then we have the site name, which would be Instagram in this example. By the way, if any of this is not making sense or you have questions, be sure to comment that down below. I do my best to answer as many of you guys as possible. But congratulations, we have 2 more examples in this tutorial. And that is what to do when you're referencing a YouTube video or a TED Talk that you found, I'm going to signify that we found on YouTube. I wanted to include both of these because oftentimes when you're on YouTube, a TED Talk is not uncommon to want to reference in an academic paper. However, they are different. So, starting with the YouTube video, this is similar to the social media in that you need to include the author of the channel or the creator of the channel. You need to include the channel name, the date, the title of the video. The description here will always be video. Then you have the site name, which here will always be YouTube, and the URL. So let's say you are citing one of my videos. Here's a great example of why you include both of these elements for the name, because my name is different than my channel. So you can clearly see that reflected in the reference list entry. Everything else looks just like the other examples that we've worked on, so I'm not going to go into detail there. I will show you that I included what an in-text citation looks like for a direct quote, just so you can see one of those examples in this tutorial. Let's say that you like exactly what I say at 7 minutes and 63 seconds. That doesn't make sense. Let's change that to 53. Okay, you like the line I say at 7:53. Well, you want to include that in your paper verbatim, in which case you need to include a source locator, which for a video will be a timestamp. But now let's look at the TED Talk example. So the biggest difference here is going to be in the naming element, because rather than include the author, you're going to include the channel name, which quite frankly will always be TED. Next, you have the date element, nothing changes there. However, in the title element, you're going to include the talk title instead of the title of the video. However, I will say that the talk title is typically always going to be included where the title of the video is located. However, APA just wanted to decipher between the difference when you're referencing a TED Talk versus a traditional YouTube video. Please note how the description in square brackets stays video, since it will always be a video if it's on YouTube. And then the source information is the same, since again, you're finding it on YouTube. And then of course you want to include that live URL so the reader can reference this video if they would like. And then note how the in-text citation uses TED, not Brené Brown, even though Brené Brown is the one giving this talk. That's because you still want to follow traditional principles and that you always want to include the naming element in your in-text citation, which in this case is good old TED. And we're back. All right, friends, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Well, I hope you learned something at the very least. I don't know how much enjoyment you got from citing and referencing, so at the end of the day, I hope you learned something. As always, be sure to give this video a big thumbs up if you did learn something, share it with your friends, and of course, subscribe to this channel for more videos like this every week. Thanks, guys.